There are few people in the world who know as much about where words come from as Mark Forsyth. His first book, the Etymologicon, was a journey through the origins of many common words and their connections. And he has since written various other books about words, language, and writing. In this interview, Mark tells fascinating and entertaining stories about where words come from, how to remember them, and how to use those words to be a better communicator. I hope you enjoy it. Mr. Mark Forsyth, thank you very much for taking the time to talk to me today.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me on.
Just before we begin, for people who don't know you and your work, could you just explain a little bit about who you are and what you do?
I'm an author. I write books, and my first three books were all about the history of the English language in some sense or another. My first book was called the Etymologicon, and it was all about the strange stories behind English words and the etymology, which is where a word comes from, how it's derived. But it's mainly the funny stories, because a lot of the words have these utterly ridiculous and absurd and funny origins. And so I just wanted to write about them. I'd been writing a blog originally about them and just stories that amused me. And then I wove them all together into a book, and it did well. And so publishers wanted another book. So my second one was called the Horologicon, which was about strange words that exist in the English language. You'll find them in a dictionary somewhere, but people have forgotten them. They've fallen out of use, and words that amused me. Things like that. There's an actual real Anglo-Saxon word, an Old English word therefore from over 1,000 years ago, utkeara, which literally means lying awake before dawn, not being able to get back to sleep because you're so worried about the day to come. It's literally pre-dawn care, and it's a feeling I've had many, many times, and it's just lovely to know that there once was a word for this, or the fear of ergophobia, the fear of going to work, which I suffer from immensely, and also just sort of sometimes beautiful sounding words like wamble cropped, which is so it used to be that if you had indigestion, that was a touch of the wambles, and if it was or wombles, and if it was so bad that you couldn't stand up, you fell by then you were said to be womble cropped or wamble cropped, and it's just such a lovely word, lovely word to say. And then my third book was about the figures of rhetoric. It's called The Elements of Eloquence. And the figures of rhetoric are ways of arranging a sentence to make it more memorable or more beautiful without having anything to say at all. So, for example, there's one, just to give you an idea of what a figure is. There's a figure of rhetoric called diacope, which is when you say ABA, one word, then another word, then the first word again. So Bond, James Bond, or Home Sweet Home, or Burn Baby Burn, or Captain My Captain, or it goes Game Over Baby, Game Over, to be or not to be. All of these are basically the same structure, and there's a name for that structure, diacope, and there are many of these structures, so I've got to write a whole book about them and how they've been used across time and across literature.
Wow! And then since then, you've written some other books, right? I know that recently you published a book about drunkenness.
Yes. So after that, I did a very short book about bookshops and how lovely it is to go into a real bookshop and find by chance a beautiful book. That's very short. It's called The Unknown Unknown. And then I did one on the history of Christmas and the origins of Christmas traditions. And then my last one was a history of drunkenness, short history of drunkenness, it's called, which has been translated to loads of languages, which is nice, because something I should have noticed earlier on when I was writing books about the English language. Obviously, they're all untranslatable, really. They've never been attempted. They wrote about drunkenness, and it's this universal subject. So it's great because you don't have to do any work, and it suddenly keeps being published again and again. Which is about how people got drunk in different times and places. So if you were in ancient Egypt and you wanted to get sloshed, what did you do? Where did you go? What were you drinking? Who were you drinking with? And when? What time of day? Were women allowed? Was it friends or family, or so on and so forth. And yeah, how did that apply if you're in ancient Rome, or what was a Wild West saloon actually like? And what did drunkenness mean in all these different cultures? Which is a fascinating question, because I love drinking myself, but I've never been quite sure what it is that we're doing when we're drinking. Why are we doing this?
Well, I think anybody who has an interest in drinking, so that's basically all of the British population, and well, most of Europe should probably read the book, right?
Yes, indeed, Australia. One of my favourite facts, I discovered, was that Australia was actually founded as a dry colony. That was the idea. There would be no booze ever in Australia.
How things have changed.
Of all the great plans in history, that's the one that really, really went down badly.
Can you tell me about when you realised that you were first interested in language?
I think I always have been. I sometimes answer this by saying I got a copy of the Oxford English Dictionary as a christening present, and I've never recovered. But it's the thing. I'm interested in anything which is very familiar, so familiar that we don't stop and think about it. So in that sense, I'm interested in drunkenness and language are the same, insofar as everybody talks and then almost everybody drinks, but we don't stop and say, where does that word come from? Why? Just to give you an example of a simple etymology, why are you a fan of something? It's a simple term, but why are you a fan? It's just short for fanatic. So except we tend to use fanatic about terrorists and crazy people, and we use fan about people who like pop groups. But fan is short for fanatic. These simple points, or why. One that's always fascinated me is why you use the same word for different things. So there's a strange collection of. I'll give you an example of buffalo. There's an animal, a buffalo. We all know what a buffalo is, and there used to be a lot of buffalo leather was used for polishing things, and also people made clothes out of it. And it was always shortened to buff, so it was buff leather. And so when you study something, you buff up on it. Well, when you polish something, you buff it, and that's why we still have the term. You've been to the gym a lot, and you've got lots of muscles. He said, you're looking really buff, you're looking good, you're looking shiny, like something that's just been polished. But you also have the Victorians used to, you could wear buffalo leather, and it's approximately the same color as skin. So if you're wearing buffalo leather, it sort of looks like you're naked, which is why we still have the phrase, he's in the buff, meaning he's naked. And then a weird one, one lot of people who wore buffalo leather in the 19th century, that's what firefighters wore. They wore buffalo leather suits because it's good for keeping the flames off. And it's a strange thing, but in New York in the late 19th century, people loved to go and watch fires and firefighters fighting fires. And it's what little boys did, in the way you might admire a sportsman or something. There'd be a fire, everyone would run over and watch the firefighters, and boys would have their favorite firefighters, and oh, he's my hero. And they were so keen on it that they became known as fire buffs, which meant they were enthusiasts. And that's why you still have a film buff these days, or a music buff. It's the same buff, and they're all short for buffalo, which is just a strange, weird connection between looking buff in the buff and buffing up on something and being a film buff.
Wow. I mean, well, I actually have this. This was the first book of yours that I ever read. This was how I got to know you, the Etymologicon. And I think when I was reading it, this was something that surprised me, how words can end up in strange places, but when you follow the story, it's quite logical in a way. And I'm wondering if, because the majority of my audience, they're people learning a foreign language, and I don't know if you have any experience learning a foreign language.
I mean, I've learned to some extent French and Spanish and German. My German is very, very regular.
Okay, and I'm wondering if you kind of think that learning these stories, learning the origins of the word, might actually help you to kind of remember them.
Oh yes, it probably would, and also it means that often you might discover a cognate that you haven't really thought of before once you see that once you see the connection, I don't know, but if, for example, let's take the word amateur. I've always liked this. Well, why is amateur amateur? And it's because if you are an amateur, if you're doing it for nothing, you're doing it for love. And that's what an amateur is. It's a lover. And it comes from the same root, therefore, as amare in Latin, aimer in French, te amo in Spanish. It's all that same thing. Well, once you've seen that, then the word amateur makes perfect sense. As you're a lover, you do it for
nothing. Yeah, no, that does. I mean, I'm sure that anybody watching this who maybe, that word wasn't kind of immediately available to them, if they think about doing it for love, it helps to make the word more familiar kind of instantly, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And sometimes, especially you find this in Scandinavia, if you're an English speaker, there are so many words which are close cognates, but you don't quite see that the second somebody points out what the sentence means, you can see it. So I remember being with a Norwegian friend of mine in Oslo, and there was a sign by the side of the road about tre fella or something, and I forget precisely. And I asked what the sign meant, and he said, "Oh, they're chopping the trees down." And I realised it was tree felling was going on. It's perfectly simple English, but just slightly disguised. And the same thing. Sometimes I like to just try and learn a language very briefly, not with the intention of ever becoming fluent, but just to see what it's like. And I often do that if I'm just going to visit somewhere. So I had that. I learnt Danish for 3 weeks before visiting Denmark. I didn't actually use it at all because everybody in Denmark speaks utterly perfect English. And because even in little shops or something, you go in there with it, they're just asking in English. And but it was lovely seeing the cognates and working out. Yes, because Danish is the closest language to English, just about.
Yeah, I think that's really cool, actually, and it's something that I tell a lot of people who are learning a language is that your objective doesn't always have to be fluent, like ready to do international business. Like you can just learn a language just for a bit of fun. Dip in, learn some interesting facts, and that's great.
See what it's like. I did that with Chinese once. I mean, I've never actually been to China at all, but I've been, because I read lots of books about linguistics. I've heard things like Chinese doesn't have grammar, and I was thinking, how does a language work without grammar? And so I sat down, I started learning Chinese. I mean, I got nowhere. I did it for a month or so, but I saw that there is indeed no grammar. The verbs never change. It's I, he, you, we, all have the same thing. And there aren't tenses either in these. So it's I ate. So it's I eat, he eat, they eat, yesterday they eat. It's always the same verb, which is amazing for if you've learned English, or especially if, like me, I learned Latin at school and there's Spanish and all those irregular verbs. The notion that a verb never changes, you just learn one word, that's it, done. It's, oh my God, if only Latin had been like that.
It's fabulous, right? And for me, it's interesting to see how your first language affects the way that you speak, any other languages you learn. Like, a lot of people who speak Mandarin, when they speak English, they don't conjugate their verbs because it's not something that comes naturally to them,
Yes, no concept of it. And I mean, similarly for an English person, when I try and learn other languages, the gender is always a nightmare. Is you have to learn the word and then this extraneous fact about the word. Is it masculine or feminine? Well, why is it la fenêtre or whatever it happens to be, the window? Why are windows female? Well, what's going on? If only there were a pattern, and there is no pattern. And then it's even harder for the reason my German is so ropey is that if you see what I mean, if you give me 5 minutes, I can come up with a good German sentence, a correct German sentence. But it's trying to remember what form of the word the to use, because they're definitely hard, because der, die, das, den, die, das, etc. So when I'm trying to think of a German sentence, you're running through and you're going, okay, what gender is that? Okay, now it's got this preposition before it. Aus bei mit that Zeit von zu, all take the dative, so it's the dative feminine. And it takes me 30 seconds to work out how to say the word the. So, which means I can't really speak German, but unless you give me 5 minutes between each sentence. But yes, it's very hard to get those strange concepts. But I mean, the reverse happens.
Yeah, of course. Like English has some kind of weird things. For example, with prepositions that are to languages which don't have prepositions are just seem like a nightmare. There's no rhyme or reason. Why is it in or on or at? I can understand it from both perspectives.
Phrasal verbs which are so easy to a native speaker and just make no sense to a non-native speaker. Well, the difference between mucking in, mucking up, mucking around,
Mucking out.
yes.
So I was wondering if maybe you could give some examples of some of your kind of favorite etymologies, like some of them may be more interesting or crazy stories about some words.
Okay, here's one. There's a food company in America in the 1930s started making a tinned meat product, spiced ham essentially. So they shortened it and they called it Spam. And Spam was sold in shops all over the place, just tinned meat, and you can still buy Spam in the shops today. And then when the Second World War happened, and Britain had a massive food shortage, and these convoys had to come over from America to Britain, loaded with food, and obviously it needed to be preserved, so tin food was best, and they wanted lots of meat. So actually those Atlantic convoys, were filled with tins of Spam, and this was the survival food of the British. And as a result, it became part of the British diet, and especially of the cheap British diet from then on. So in cheap cafes, the ones we call greasy spoons, sort of workman's cafe where you go get a cheap meal, they served lots of Spam. And as a result of that, there was a Monty Python sketch where a guy goes into a greasy spoon and says, "What do you have on the menu?" And she says, "We've got grilled Spams, fried Spam, roast Spam, Spam with Spam, Spam on the side, Spam," and goes on like that. And then for some reason, because it's Monty Python, because it's surreal, there are some Vikings in the background who start singing this song. They go, "Spam, Spam, 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 Spam," and they won't stop. It goes on and on forever. Because of that Monty Python sketch, there was, in the early days of the internet, the very early days of the internet, this is 1980s, there was a practical joke people would play on each other. I'd send you a computer program, and the first line of the computer program was print the word spam on the screen, and the second line of the program was go back to the first line. So if you ran that program, your screen would just go spam, 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 on and on forever, like in the Monty Python sketch. And because of that, the word spam started meaning any email you got that you didn't want to get. Oh no, don't press run on that. It's a spam email, and your screen will just end up going spam. And that's why you have spam emails still. As your spam folder on my email account, there is a spam folder, and you use spam emails, and we're all familiar with that. And meanwhile, the original spiced ham food product is still in the supermarkets. But the meaning has gone via the Second World War and Monty Python and the invention of the internet to mean a completely different word, spam email.
What are some great resources that students can use to kind of research the etymology of words to find them out?
The very best one is Etymonline, it's called. So that's ETYMONLINE. And that's an online etymological dictionary. It's extremely reliable. It's very well researched, and gives you pretty much everything you need. But that's always and it's free. It's always my first port of call. If you have access to it, then the Oxford English Dictionary is the ultimate reference work. It's bigger, it gives all of its sources, it's huge, because the actual Oxford English Dictionary, the full thing, is 26 volumes, so it's a massive thing. If you are at a university, then your university library may well have a subscription, otherwise you have to pay some amount per year. Or if you have a local library card in Britain, you can use the Oxford English Dictionary for free using the number on the library card. Um, those are the two main ones. I believe there's also, I don't use it much, but there is Wiktionary on the internet, which does many different languages, so that may be more useful to your viewers.
Okay. And when people hear stories about word origins, how do they know whether or not those stories are true? Because like for example, there's so many stories about where the word "okay" came from, and most of them are false. For example, so what are some techniques people can use to detect a false etymology?
The first one is, the rule of thumb is, if people say it's an acronym, then it's almost certainly not. That's the one that always goes around. There are a couple which really are acronyms, like laser and scuba, but almost everything is not an acronym. The best would be simply to check it on Etym Online. If it sounds too good to be true, it probably is. It's strange because they do go around an awful lot, and I often have the embarrassing thing of somebody when I explain to people what I do, and they say, "Oh, have you heard the story of this?" And I have to go, "Yeah, I have that's nonsense," and you feel sort of bad taking people down. So I try not to do it, but yeah, there's an awful lot of silly stories floating around, which is strange because usually the real story is just as ridiculous, if you see what I mean. You can involve the Second World War and Monty Python and the internet, or whatever it happens to be, and these extraordinary connections. I mean, also there's one which I've always liked, which is in an Indian restaurant you can get a naan bread. It's because it's the I think it's the Urdu, yes, Urdu in Hindi. I can't quite remember the matter. The thing is, so all of the languages, basically from Western Europe all the way across to northern India, almost all of the languages are cousins. They're all derived from an original language, which we can sort of reconstruct, which is known as Proto-Indo-European. Once upon a time, somewhere around the Black Sea, there were some people who spoke this language, and then in about 5,000-6,000 years ago, they expanded massively, and they must have gone out invading. Nobody can quite work out why. And as they separated, their dialects separated. They started speaking with stronger accents, etc. And then the languages so became mutually incomprehensible, which is why the direct descendants of those people who are down in England speak English, and but if you're in northern India, you are speaking Urdu or Hindi, and but they are related languages all the way across. And Italian and Greek and Russian, there are some which are different, like Finnish is different, and the Semitic languages like Arabic and Hebrew, but largely they're all the same. So a beautiful one is that in that original language there seems to have been a word, something like nag, which meant uncovered, naked, and down into the European languages, that became, but it went into the Germanic ones and then to English as naked, which is quite similar. You can see how nagt. And then went into the Romance languages like Latin, Italian as nude, and that's where the word nude comes from. A slightly posher word for naked, but it's just the same thing. But in Persia, they would cook meat. They would cook their meat by burying it in charcoal, which would cook meat very well. But the bread you cooked on the top, uncovered. And so they called their bread, the uncovered stuff, they called it naan. And that then went into the Indian languages as naan, which is why naan and naked are ultimately, as it were, the same word, just separated by 5,000 years.
5,000 years. So next time I go to an Indian restaurant and order my naked garlic, I'm going to appreciate it even more.
It's the same with pun. So the Punjab in northern India is the land of 5 rivers. That's what Punjab means. But that same pun is in the pen in pentagon, and so therefore the name of the the building where the American military headquarters are, is the Pentagon and the Punjab. It's the same pen. I love that sort of connection.
Wow, crazy. So I thought we could kind of move on now and talk a little bit more about the third book you wrote, which was the Elements of Eloquence, which is more about basically how to kind of write well in English. You know, how to the secrets. Yes, an amazing book. I think that should be compulsory instead of oh my God, what's it called? The Elements of Style. Yeah.
Oh yes.
Yeah, which is full of terrible writing advice, in my opinion. I'm not going to draw. Don't worry, you don't have to say anything about that. No. And I'm wondering if you could give some examples of some ways that people could use some of these techniques to write some more interesting sentences.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I gave you the example of Daguerre earlier on, but another nice one is progressio, which is a very simple form to work out. It's basically, if you in the Bible, there's a bit in the Bible, Ecclesiastes chapter 3, which has this beautiful sonorous passage where it says, there is a time to be born and a time to die, a time to weep and a time to rejoice, a time to build up and a time to scatter, a time to reap and a time to sow and a time to reap. And it's one thing and then it's opposite. And if you think about it, you could just say, well, there's a time for everything. But it's a much nicer way of saying exactly that, is to have all these long opposites. And you have the same thing in Charles Dickens, in probably the most famous passage he wrote. It was the best of times, it was the worst of times, it was the epoch of belief, it was the epoch of incredulity. One thing, then it's opposite, one thing, then it's opposite. And then you have the same thing with the Katy Perry song, Hot and Cold. You're hot, then you're cold, you're yes, then you're no, you're up, then you're down, you're no. Or in the Beatles song, Hello, Goodbye. You say stop, I say go, you say goodbye, I say hello. It's just keep saying one thing and it's opposite. You say tomato, I say tomato. You say potato, I say potato. Just keep doing one thing and it's opposite. And you don't actually say anything at all, but it sounds great. It sounds wonderful. And you get to be like Paul McCartney or Charles Dickens or God or Katy Perry, whichever it is you prefer out of those people.
I know who I'm choosing. So, but obviously these techniques must be used with care, because if you overuse them, and like especially if you have a low level in a language, you know, maybe that kind of that sense of repetition, or that these techniques could maybe come across as just bad language instead of deliberate technique.
I suppose they could, yes. I mean, it's always, you have to be very careful in another language. I always find that I never ever swear in other languages, because you can never work out exactly how bad this word is and is it appropriate to this situation. So I just absolutely leave it. But yes, it's slightly advanced, the elements of eloquence, but yes, it can. Also these techniques can be used in any language, really. My one is, all the examples are famous phrases in English, but for example, I mean, there's one which is the very simple no, no, no. Repeat a word 3 times. I mean, that's really simple. But you know, King Lear has this famous line where he says how. Margaret Thatcher said no, no, no. Tony Blair said education, education, education. And then these are all famous lines which are now in the dictionary of quotations. So it can be incredibly simple using this.
It is interesting. It seems almost childish, but there's something about the power. Maybe as well, there's something about the power of things coming in threes.
Yes, there is. It's called the tricolon. I don't know why 3s are so powerful, but they are. Or the power of just starting. I mean, starting every sentence with the same words. It's called anaphora. We shall fight them on the beaches. We shall fight them in the fields we shall find. But you just start each sentence with the same words. And it works here, it works there, it works in France, it works in Italy. It's a great way of just reinforcing the point and sounding more convincing than you are.
Yeah. So what about some of the other maybe more elaborate kind of techniques? Can you give me an example of one of those?
Well, there's chiasmus, which is a very nice one, which is when you try and essentially reverse the order of the words in two different sentences. So, ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country. Or mankind must put an end to war, or war will put an end to mankind. T for two and two for tea. It's a beautiful technique. When the going gets tough, the tough get going. It's makes a memorable phrase, but it's also usually involves a little bit of wordplay, and it's a bit more elaborate and harder to do.
Yeah, yeah. And that sort of brings me to my next question, which is if somebody wants to be a better writer, because there's a famous quote which has been attributed to various different people, probably none of them said it, which was, if you want to be a better writer, you need to sit down at the typewriter and bleed. And I'm wondering how you feel about the idea that being a good writer is just about kind of practice rather than maybe deliberate kind of study of techniques.
I think it's both. I mean, I don't think the bleeding, the whole suffering thing, I've never really come across. If you sit down with a typewriter and bleed, get up from the typewriter. There's something very wrong with your typewriter. Yes, I would say you need to study grammar, punctuation. I mean, a lot of English people don't know their own grammar because it's not really taught to us in school, because it comes completely naturally. I mean, the same thing actually, oddly enough, applies to a lot of German people. Don't know their own, well, are unable to explain their own grammar because it's incredibly complicated, but they've just grown up with it, so they don't know it, and they haven't had to learn it in the way I was talking about earlier. Yes, you should know your grammar and your punctuation and everything like that. And then, yes, practice, and then things like, the figures of rhetoric. I mean, that's why I wrote The Elements of Eloquence. Some books have been written on it, that there have been very few in the last few hundred years. But Shakespeare learnt all of the figures of rhetoric. That's basically what you had to learn at school 400 years ago, was you had these figures of rhetoric beaten into you. He would have learned them, though, oddly enough, on Latin, but they also work in English.
Yeah, I mean, is there any kind of understanding as to why we find these techniques so attractive?
Not really, no. I mean, I don't think there's ever been any research into it. Things, they just work. And the funny thing is, they used to be taught deliberately. As I say, Shakespeare would have learnt these by heart. And then in the 19th century, you got this romantic idea of that poetry should just come to you. And also you have a lot of people who are suspicious of rhetoric because they say, well, it just makes bad ideas sound good. That's just rhetoric. That's just fine words. And where are the actions? So it's been very unfashionable for a couple of hundred years, but it still works. I mean, that's why Paul McCartney and Katy Perry clean up, because these lines still, these techniques still really work on us. We like those repetitions and those rhythms.
For anybody who's trying to improve their writing, what's that kind of balance between, spending a lot of time actually writing and just practicing maybe the idea of just producing and getting your thoughts onto paper, and the balance between that and then kind of saying, okay, I'm going to look at this sentence and I'm going to try and make it fit this technique? Or,
well, I think of it like a bit like jazz, actually. So I think that if you do lots of practice, then when it comes to it, when inspiration arrives, then you will be ready to go. In the same way that if you want to be a great jazz musician, you have to learn a lot of scales and an awful lot of music theory and play it. And that means that when you come out on the stage and start just improvising with a band, and they're all improvising and you're bouncing off each other, you're brilliant because you've done so much practice. And similarly, I think certainly when I'm writing my books, I write them very quickly, actually. But that's because I've done an awful lot of practice, and I can therefore just let it flow. Or I hope that's the case.
Yeah. I mean, for anybody kind of interested, do you maybe have like a plan, like just a piece of paper with some bullet points? Is that how are these things floating around in your mind for months before you actually sit down to write?
I have a piece of paper with bullet points. Well, I do all my research. I mean, when I'm writing a book, I do all my research. I take lots of notes. I make sure I know the subject backwards, forwards, and sideways before I start the chapter, and then just go. And I have, yes, a few bullet points, a vague notion of what I've got to say and where I'm ending up. I always think it's a good idea to know where you're going is the most important thing in writing. There was one writer, I can't remember who it was, famous author, who would always write the last line of his novel first and then just pin it up on the wall behind the typewriter. So he always knew where he was aiming. I'm aiming for that line there, and in about 60,000 words a time, I'm going to get there.
Wow, interesting. I mean, you've self-described, I believe, as a pedant, and so I'm sort of wondering again about this balance. How do you feel about the balance between maybe following some of these grammar rules that people got taught at school, like, don't end a sentence with a preposition, never start a sentence with and, all that kind of, don't split your infinitive. How do you feel about the balance between that and creativity, like playing with language, being inventive?
I'm all for the playing. And first of all, every single rule you just stated there isn't a rule. It's wrong. This is such stuff as dreams are made on, to quote Shakespeare. It ends the sentence with a preposition. I don't know how that rule got thought up or how it came about, but if you think of it, we're talking only about phrasal verbs. You wouldn't be able to use any phrasal verb in the imperative. You wouldn't be able to say, look out, get down, we're being fired on. You'd have to say, out, look, down, get on, we're being fired. I mean, it's complete nonsense. It is such stuff as dreams are made on. Churchill made fun of it. Well, allegedly it was Churchill who said, this is a kind of English up with which I will not put. It's similarly what were you saying, split infinitives. That's no one even knows who thought that up. It seems to have appeared in the 1820s sometime, but the infinitive in English is one word anyway. If you it doesn't contain the preposition to. That's a preposition that often introduces the infinitive. So if you take the sentence, I helped him escape. Escape is infinitive there, helps. But don't start sentences with the word and. I mean, whoever thinks that hasn't read the Byron poem, and thou art dead as young and fair as all of human birth. Shakespeare started sentences with and. Byron did. Loads of great literature does. Those rules don't exist. I think it's more. You should definitely play with the language. You shouldn't let anything stop you. But it's more knowing what you're doing, working out the structure, and knowing that if you do use a word like this, you can use a word deliberately wrongly, or you can reverse the normal word order in order to create an effect.
Yeah, exactly. But what about, so, I mean, I think I mentioned some very kind of, maybe what you would call kind of grammar rules, but what about rules that are handed down by other kind of stylists who say things like, you should try and avoid the passive, things which are more kind of vague. How do you feel about that kind of advice?
I mean, there are some people who say never use an adverb.
Good luck with that.
Especially as never in that sentence is an adverb, isn't it? But sometimes just setting yourself a rule can produce interesting results. It's like there's that. There are a couple of novels written which don't use the word "e" ever, which is a very hard thing to do, but possible, and it makes you stop and think about your language. And often it's just a question of almost of having your own sense of style and sense of taste, and saying, okay, for my writing, I will never use an adjective or an adverb, or I will always do this. I will never use the passive, because it makes you stop all the time and have to rethink your sentences, which can have very interesting results. I mean, personally, I use the passive quite a lot, and that really comes from the George Orwell essay on political writing, where he points out quite correctly, you get a lot of news headlines where rather than saying, you know, somebody's called, so you get a passive headline saying the Prime Minister is criticised for this announcement, rather than saying who's doing the criticising, which you should do, because it turns out they're just being criticised by the leader of the opposition, in which case, well, obviously it's the leader of the opposition's job to criticise the Prime Minister. Yeah, there isn't a story here, but to say that people were outraged or that sort of thing. But there's no real problem with passive.
So in the world of kind of language learning, there's been a lot of research that shows a strong correlation between people who read a lot and their kind of not only their language ability, but also their vocabulary size and things like that. So I'm wondering as well if you think that you know, part of being a good writer is also being a good reader.
Yes, definitely. I mean, you'll get so many ideas. Just exposing yourself to the finer things. If you're only reading great books and professional writing, then that will become the standard in your mind. Whereas if you don't, then you'll simply get a lower standard.
A lot of students, when they're learning a language, what they'll do is they'll spend a lot of time learning about grammar, and they'll a lot of them can be very good at filling in a worksheet, and they can be very good at, you know, putting the correct word in the hole, and they can be great at maybe even doing an exam. But then when it comes to real communication, like having a conversation, they struggle, and sometimes they have no experience with conversations.
Do you want my tip on this? This is my this is a cheat, but I really do mean this. It may sound like a joke, but you should learn the filler words, the meaningless filler words in the other language. So in English, you often use a word like so, or I mean, I think, you know. So you can say an Englishman doesn't actually talk in perfect clear English. An Englishman says, well, you know, I know that the thing is, I mean, really now, because what I'm going to say is that and you can talk for 10 seconds without saying anything. And you have the same thing. I always like in French, they just use the word sometimes they say en fait, but mainly it's like, yeah, je suis j'ai film en fait. But yes, learn the meaningless words. Learn to stammer in English, as it were. Learn.
But how do you kind of feel about the idea that maybe right now in the world there are, you know, millions, literally millions of students who can do a worksheet but can't have a conversation? Would you even describe them as language users?
Yes, in a way. I mean, I don't have some sort of great dividing line down the population saying language users, not language users. That would be silly. They're trying. I mean, I to come back to my German's pretty bad, but I often like to read in German. Like I can do that, and it means I can read German literature and German poetry, and it's very nice. I like those dual language textbooks I can flick across, and if I don't understand a lot, it's something I enjoy. Does it make me a brilliant German speaker? Absolutely not. I can barely hold a conversation, but it's nice nonetheless.
If people want to find out more about your work, if they want to buy your books, what's the best place for them to? Where should they go to do that?
Well, if bookshops are open, they should go to a bookshop. Otherwise, you can. They're all available as ebooks. They're available as Kindle. They're available from Amazon and all the similar things. And yes, as I say, Short History of Drunkenness has been translated into about 15 or 20 languages now. So Breve Historia della Borrachera. So it may well be available in their native language, whatever that happens to be.
Just before we finish up, I was wondering if, because I ask everybody this, why do you think it is that language is important to us as humans?
Because language is all of our, well, not all, but it is most of our communication. And I think something we're all noticing during this lockdown and this isolation year is the lack of connection and communication we have, which would be so lovely. And language is how you get on in life. Language is how you move through the world and how you tell people who you are.
Well, Mark Forsyth, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you very much. Thanks a lot.